Dr. Sarah Chen thought the carved glyphs were vandalism until the pattern repeated across 40 miles of old-growth forest. When her linguistic analysis software flagged them as proto-writing with semantic consistency, she knew she was staring at something impossible. The final message, etched into a dying cedar at the research station perimeter, translated to a single desperate word that made her blood run cold. Witness. Olympic National Park, Washington State. October 2023. The ranger's voice crackled through Sarah Chen's satellite phone at 4:47 a.m., pulling her from restless sleep in the University of Washington field cabin. Dr. Chen, we've got something unusual. Tree damage on the Ho River Trail. Thought you might want to see it before we file the report. Sarah pushed tangled black hair from her face, squinting at the LED clock. Her linguistic anthropology fieldwork focused on indigenous Kinnaw oral traditions, not park vandalism. But Ranger Mike Osterman knew her research involved historical tree markings, and she owed him favors. How unusual, she asked, already reaching for her field vest. Honestly, I don't know what the hell I'm looking at. 40 minutes later, Sarah stood before a western red cedar, her headlamp illuminating deep vertical cuts in the cambium layer. The wounds were fresh, sap still gleaming amber in the cold October air, but these weren't random scratches from bear claws or elk antlers. They were organized. Jesus, she whispered, her breath misting. Her fingers hovered millimeters from the bark, not quite touching. 3 parallel grooves, each approximately 2 centimeters wide, formed a vertical column. Cross-hatching at irregular intervals created distinct segments. At the base, a cluster of shorter marks radiated outward like a crude sunburst. Mike shifted behind her, his Park Service jacket rustling. Vandals? No. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Tool marks from illegal logging, but why so shallow? And the distribution. She stepped back, scanning the broader pattern. Mike, how many trees? Found 6 so far, all within a quarter-mile radius, all old-growth cedars. Sarah's pulse quickened. Show me the others. They hiked through the pre-dawn forest, the moss-draped silence broken only by their footfalls and the distant rush of the Ho River. Each cedar bore similar markings, vertical columns, cross-hatches, radiating elements. But the patterns varied. Sarah photographed each tree methodically, her trained eye catching subtle distinctions, the number of grooves per column, the spacing of cross-hatches, the orientation of radiating marks. By the time weak sunlight filtered through the canopy, Sarah had documented 6 trees and formed a hypothesis she didn't dare voice. I need to run some analysis, she told Mike, her voice carefully neutral. Can you GPS mark these locations and check for more? Don't touch them. And Mike, let's keep this quiet until I figure out what we're dealing with. He studied her face, weathered features, skeptical. You think this is significant? I think premature publicity could compromise whatever this is. Back at the field cabin, Sarah uploaded the photographs to her laptop and launched the pattern recognition software she'd developed for analyzing historical indigenous pictographs. The program mapped spatial relationships, identified recurring elements, and compared them against databases of known symbolic systems. 3 hours later, staring at the results, Sarah felt the floor tilt beneath her. Statistical confidence, 94. 7% classification, proto-writing system. Semantic consistency, high known language, match, none. The marks weren't random. They weren't decoration. They were communicating. Sarah's hands trembled as she cross-referenced the patterns. Each tree displayed a distinct configuration, but underlying grammatical structures emerged, positional syntax, repeated morphological elements, systematic variation that suggested meaning. This was how early writing systems worked, pictographic elements evolving toward abstract representation. But who the hell carved them? And when? She examined the wound margins under digital magnification. The cuts were deep, but not jagged, executed with purpose, not rage. 3 distinct grooves per stroke suggested fingers? No, the spacing was wrong. The pressure distribution indicated something with greater force than human hands, but controlled precision. Sarah opened her field notes from indigenous consultations. The Quinault elders spoke of Siatik, the stick Indians, forest beings that communicated through wood-knocking and left territorial markers. She documented those stories as folklore, cultural memory of pre-contact interactions with neighboring tribes. But what if the stories weren't metaphorical? Her phone buzzed. Mike's text included GPS coordinates. Found 12 more. They form a line heading northeast toward Glacier Meadows. Last one is, you need to see this. Sarah grabbed her gear and drove the logging road to Mike's location. He waited at the trailhead, face pale. It's on the boundary cedar, he said quietly, the one we've been monitoring for disease. Sarah knew that tree, a 900-year-old giant, sacred to the Quinault, dying from fungal infection despite intervention efforts. She hiked the half-mile trail with dread building in her chest. The boundary cedar stood at the edge of Glacier Meadows, its massive trunk scarred and weeping, and there, carved at exactly Sarah's eye level, was a message unlike the others. The vertical columns were taller, more elaborate. The cross-hatching formed deliberate clusters, and at the center, her breath caught, was an unmistakable pictographic element, a simplified human figure, arms raised, facing a larger figure with exaggerated proportions. Between them, a series of marks that repeated elements from all the other trees. Sarah's software had flagged similar patterns in ancient proto-cuneiform, syntactic clustering indicating complex predication, subject-verb, object, a sentence. She photographed the carving from every angle, her mind spinning. The human figure was clearly representational. The larger figure was, what? Stylized? Mythological? Or documentary? Dr. Chen? Mike's voice was tight. What am I looking at? Sarah couldn't answer. She was staring at the base of the carving, where the signature element appeared, the radiating mark she'd seen on every tree. But here, they surrounded a single deep depression in the bark, a handprint, but not human. The palm span was nearly 12 inches across, 4 fingers, each tipped with a sharp puncture mark. No thumb opposition, instead a lateral digit placement, suggesting something between human and ape morphology. Sarah felt her scientific worldview cracking. Every rational explanation, hoax, undocumented tribal practice, mass delusion, crumbled against the physical evidence. The wound depth required immense strength. The consistent grammar across 18 trees demanded cognitive sophistication. And the placement, always on dying cedars along a clear territorial boundary, suggested intentional communication with specific recipients. Mike, she said slowly, I need to bring in a forensics team. Quietly. Can you lock down this area? Research preservation, environmental sensitivity, whatever justification works? Sarah, what the hell is this? He met his eyes. Either the most elaborate hoax in anthropological history or evidence of a population we didn't know existed. You're talking about... I'm not talking about anything yet. Her voice sharpened. Because if I'm right, and this goes public before we understand the implications, we could trigger a catastrophe. Media circus, trophy hunters, government containment protocols, whatever left these messages chose trees in a protected area, far from trails. They're hiding, Mike, and they're trying to tell us something. He processed that, jaw working. What do you need? Time, access, and absolute confidentiality. Mike nodded slowly. I'll route trail traffic away from this sector. Equipment malfunction, bear activity. I'll figure it out. But Sarah, if this is real, you can't keep it secret forever. I know. She looked back at the carving, at the human and non-human figures facing each other across the cedar's surface. But I need to understand what they're saying before I decide what the world needs to hear. Over the next week, Sarah assembled a ghost team, Dr. James Coe, a primatologist specializing in great ape cognition, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a forensic botanist, and Maria Vega, a wildlife tracking expert with Quinault heritage. Each signed ironclad NDAs. Each brought equipment under academic research permits that revealed nothing. They worked in shifts, documenting the carved trees with forensic precision. Yuki confirmed the wounds were 3 to 6 weeks old, made with organic implements, likely hardened wood or bone. The tool marks showed no metal traces. James analyzed the handprint cast and nearly dropped his calipers. "This morphology," he muttered, rotating the 3D printed model, "suggests a hominin, but the finger proportions and palmar ridges don't match Homo sapiens pan or gorilla. The thumb..." Christ, Sarah, the biomechanics here imply fine motor control comparable to humans, but in a hand twice the size. "Could it be a fabrication?" Sarah asked, though her gut already knew. "The dermal ridge patterns?" James shook his head. "That level of detail requires either the actual appendage or technology that would leave traces. I'm finding organic skin oils in the bark depression. I've sent samples for DNA analysis, but..." He hesitated. "If this is real, and we're talking about an extant hominin population, the ethical implications..." "I know," Sarah said quietly. Maria returned from tracking surveys with troubling news. "I'm finding sign," she reported, spreading topographic maps across the field cabin's table. "Not conventional prints. They're using terrain features to avoid leaving tracks, but I've got disturbed duff patterns, broken undergrowth consistent with bipedal passage, and scat that's wrong." "Wrong how?" "Omnivore diet, human-adjacent gut flora composition according to preliminary analysis. But biomass suggests a large animal. And Sarah..." Maria's dark eyes were troubled. "My grandmother told stories about the Siatic, protocols for encountering them. Respect, distance, reciprocity. This isn't folklore, it's cultural memory of coexistence." Sarah felt the weight of revelation pressing down. If an isolated population of archaic hominins survived in the Pacific Northwest's remotest corners, their existence raised staggering questions. Genetic divergence timelines, population size, subsistence strategies, and, most urgently, why reveal themselves now? The answer emerged when she finally cracked the grammar. Working through the night, Sarah mapped the recurring elements across all 18 trees: vertical columns, noun markers, crosshatches, number or time indicators, radiating marks, verbs or states. The boundary cedar's complex carving served as a Rosetta Stone, its pictographic human figure anchored meaning. She built a preliminary lexicon: single vertical column plus sunburst, here, present, multiple columns plus cluster, many group, deep crosshatches, emphasis or urgency, declining columns, less diminish. The boundary cedar message assembled: many, here, diminish, human, action needed, witness. Sarah stared at the translation, ice spreading through her veins. "We are here, we are declining. Humans must act, bear witness. They're dying," she whispered. "They're trying to reach us because they're dying." James looked up from his microscope. "What?" Sarah showed him the grammatical map. "Every marked tree is a dying cedar. They're not random targets, they're metaphors. The trees are dying and so are they. They've chosen trees on protected land, marked a territorial boundary, and left a message specifically positioned at human eye level. This isn't accidental contact, it's a calculated appeal." Yuki joined them, face grave. "If you're right, we have an obligation." "To do what?" Sarah's voice rose. "Go public, announce we've found a population of archaic hominins. Trigger a media apocalypse that brings thousands of people crashing through their habitat. Subject them to scientific scrutiny without consent. They're people, not specimens." "We don't know that," James said carefully. "Yes, we do." Sarah pointed to the carvings. "Grammar, symbolic representation, forward planning, metaphorical thinking. These are cognitive markers of personhood. And they came to us, James. They initiated contact by leaving messages they knew humans would find. That's agency. That's intentionality." Maria spoke quietly. "The Kinol protocols for Siatic encounters. Observe, respect, do not pursue. My ancestors coexisted with them for thousands of years by honoring boundaries. Maybe the question isn't whether to reveal them, but whether to answer. Sarah's heart hammered. Answer how? They left messages on trees, leave a message back. It was audacious, potentially dangerous, and the only ethical path that didn't strip the message makers of their autonomy. If we do this, Sarah said, we need protocols. Clear communication of intent, no threats, no attempts at contact beyond reciprocal messaging. We're establishing dialogue, not initiating capture. They worked through ethical frameworks, debating every scenario. Finally, they agreed. One message, carved in response on a neutral tree near the boundary cedar, using visual elements the message makers had already employed. Clear, non-threatening, reciprocal. Sarah designed the carving, a simplified human figure representing their team, facing away from the forest, showing no pursuit, with hands extended downward in a gesture of offering or respect. Below it, a single word in carved pictographic elements borrowed from the original messages. Witness. We see you. We bear witness. Maria performed a kino blessing before Sarah made the first cut. Using a bone knife, no metal, respecting the original method, she carved slowly, deliberately, into a young cedar sapling they'd chosen for its neutral position. When finished, she stepped back. The message was crude compared to the elegant original carvings, but readable. A response across species, across understanding. Now what? Yuki asked. Now, Sarah said, exhaustion and anticipation warring inside her. We wait. 3 days of silence. Sarah monitored the boundary site through remote cameras, watching wind stir the cedar boughs and rain stipple the carved surfaces. Nothing. She began to doubt. Had she misread everything? Was this an elaborate natural phenomenon her desperate mind had twisted into meaning? Then, on the 4th morning, Maria radioed from the observation post. Sarah, you need to see this. Now. Durn. Sarah drove the logging road in a record time. Adrenaline spiking. Maria waited at the trailhead, binoculars around her neck, expression unreadable. Don't move fast, Maria warned, and stay absolutely quiet. They approached the boundary cedar through heavy brush, moving with practiced stealth. 50 meters out, Maria halted, pointing. Sarah raised her own binoculars, and her breath stopped. A figure stood before the response carving. Not human. Even through the optical magnification, the scale was staggering. 8 feet tall, perhaps more, with a build suggesting immense strength beneath reddish-brown hair covering most of the visible body. The figure stood in 3/4 profile, studying the carved sapling with clear intentionality. Long arms, slightly bowed posture, a sloped cranial profile that struck Sarah with visceral wrongness and rightness simultaneously, hominin features but divergent. As she watched, the figure extended one massive hand, fingers tracing the carved human figure with delicate precision. The gesture was unmistakable. Examination. Comprehension. Then the figure did something that made Sarah's scientific objectivity shatter into wonder. It pulled a pointed implement from some kind of hide pouch at its waist, a bone stylus, Sarah realized, and began carving a response. For 27 minutes, Sarah and Maria watched in frozen silence as the figure carved systematic marks into the bark below Sarah's message. The motions were practiced, economical, suggesting this was familiar work. When finished, the figure stepped back, examined its creation, then touched the carving with one palm, a gesture Sarah had seen in the boundary cedar handprint. Then it walked away, moving through the dense forest with eerie silence, and disappeared. Sarah and Maria waited a full hour before approaching. Sarah's hands shook as she photographed the new carving. The figure had used their grammatical system, expanding on Sarah's simple message with complexity that suggested relief, or perhaps urgency. New elements appeared, clustered marks Sarah interpreted as numericals, a stark pictograph of a small figure beside a large one, parent and child, and repeated symbols of decline. Working through the grammar took hours. Back at the field cabin, Sarah mapped the syntax. Group, small number, perhaps 20-30 based on mark count. Here, Offspring, decline, dying, human, knowledge, medicine, help. Oh God, Sarah breathed. They're not just declining. Their children are dying. James reviewed the translation, expression grave. If they're experiencing reproductive failure or juvenile mortality, they're facing extinction. But Sarah, how can we help without exposing them? I know. She pressed her palms against her eyes. We need to understand what's killing them before we can even think about intervention. Yuki had been analyzing environmental samples, soil, water, vegetation from the marked territory. I'm finding elevated heavy metal concentrations, she reported, spreading geochemical maps. Legacy contamination from old mining operations upriver, plus recent increases in agricultural runoff. Nothing immediately toxic to humans, but in a small, isolated population with potential genetic bottlenecks. Bioaccumulation, James finished. If they're apex omnivores with multi-generational exposure to low-level contamination, they could be experiencing reproductive toxicity. And if they've been isolated for tens of thousands of years, they might lack the genetic diversity to adapt. Sarah felt the ethical noose tightening. To help meant understanding their biology, diet, population structure, information that required proximity, perhaps samples. But any intrusion risked the very exposure they'd fled. They initiated contact, Maria pointed out. They're asking for help. Maybe the question is how to ask their permission to help. Sarah stared at the photograph of the second message. We need to establish real communication, more sophisticated than pictographs. Something that lets us ask questions and receive answers. How? James asked skeptically. Sarah pulled up references on great ape communication studies, Kanzi's lexigram boards, Coco's sign language. We build a shared symbolic system, start with concrete concepts, expand to abstract ones. If they're leaving carved messages, they understand symbolic representation. We just need a faster, more complex medium. Over the next 2 days, Sarah designed a communication board, a plywood panel painted white, divided into grid squares, each containing a simple black pictograph. She borrowed elements from their carved messages, added universal concepts, sun, water, tree, animal, emotional states derived from primate gesture studies, and numericals. The board's center showed a carved human figure and a carved non-human figure facing each other, the fundamental grammar of dialogue. This is insane, James muttered as they mounted the board on a weatherproof frame at the boundary site. We're trying to initiate cross-species communication with a population we've barely confirmed exists. They confirmed themselves, Sarah countered, positioning the board at 7 feet, accessible to both human and non-human hands. They're cognitively sophisticated enough to develop proto-writing, spatially aware enough to mark a territorial boundary, and desperate enough to risk contact. We're just lowering the communication barrier. Below the board, they placed a simple offering: smoked fish, traditional quinoa preparation, fresh water in sealed containers, and a set of carved cedar tokens, duplicates of pictographs on the board. If the message makers understood symbolic correspondence, they could select tokens to construct messages more complex than wood carving allowed. Sarah added one more element: a small vial of sterile cotton swabs and a pictograph sequence showing the act of rubbing the swab inside the mouth and placing it in a container. Beside it, a pictograph of sickness, health symbols. You're asking for DNA, Yuki said quietly. I'm offering to analyze their health, Sarah corrected. If they're experiencing die-off, they need to understand why. Genetic analysis might reveal susceptibilities to environmental toxins, inherited conditions, inbreeding depression. It's diagnostic, not exploitative, provided they understand the offer and consent. That's why we're using visual protocol, choice, agency. They activated motion sensor cameras, retreated, and waited. Day 1, no activity. Day 2, the board had been approached, disturbed moss, broken ferns, but nothing taken, no message left. Day 3, 4 tokens had been moved. arranged in a vertical line at the board's base. Groupers, water, sick, help. Sarah's pulse hammered. They understand. They're using the system. Day 4. The fish was gone, the water containers empty, and tokens were arranged in a new sequence. Small offspring, sick, dying. Why? Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. The plaintive directness of that question, why, carried the weight of parental desperation across the species divide. She rearranged tokens in response, photographing each step. Human, knowledge, water plus earth, sick, contamination symbol, maybe help. We think the water and soil are contaminated. We might be able to help. Day 5. The tokens were rearranged. Human, see knowledge, offspring. How? How can humans understand our offspring's illness? Sarah's hands trembled as she constructed the response. Human, body knowledge, medicine, small sample, see, analyze. She placed the swabs prominently beside the sequence. Day 6. 2 swabs were gone, carefully placed in the sealed container Sarah had provided, the caps twisted shut with evident understanding of their function. Beside them, a token sequence. Trust, help, please. Sarah held the container like sacred relics. We have genetic samples, she whispered, consensually obtained, from a population that doesn't officially exist. Can we even analyze these? James asked. What lab would process samples without asking questions? I have a contact at the University of Oregon, Yuki said quietly. Dr. Reeves, evolutionary genetics. She owes me. If I frame it as an unidentified primate, suspected new species, she'll sequence it discreetly. Sarah nodded. Do it. Expedite everything. While they waited for genetic results, Sarah expanded the communication board with more abstract concepts. Time sequences, spatial relationships, complex emotional states. Each morning brought new token arrangements, questions about contamination sources, queries about offspring survival rates, and heartbreakingly, requests for hope. The message makers were learning the system rapidly, combining pictographs in increasingly sophisticated ways. On day 9, Sarah found a token sequence that stopped her cold. Long ago, humans, group, together, peace. Now, humans, many, everywhere, fear. Small group, hide, survive. Offspring dying, no future. Choose, hide plus die, or trust plus help. The historical narrative was clear. Once there had been coexistence. As human populations exploded and spread, the non-human population retreated, hid, dwindled. Now, facing extinction, they'd chosen the terrifying gambit of reaching out to the very species that drove them into hiding. Sarah constructed her response carefully. Humans, some, remember, respect, old stories, true. We, different humans, choose, help plus protect. Some humans remember the old ways. We choose to help and protect you. On day 11, Dr. Reeves called. Yuki, what the actual fuck did you send me? Sarah took the call on speaker. Dr. Reeves, this is Sarah Chen. I need you to understand that what you're about to tell me is classified under the most serious ethical research protocols. I don't know what protocols cover this, Reeves snapped. The samples you sent, I've run the sequences 3 times. The mitochondrial DNA shows a hominin lineage diverging from Homo sapiens approximately 800,000 to 1 million years ago. We're talking a separate species, possibly Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis descent, that survived into the present. The nuclear genome shows evidence of limited sapiens admixture, ancient hybridization events, maybe 40,000 years back. But the population has been isolated and declining. I'm seeing severe genetic bottlenecking, inbreeding coefficients off the charts, and she paused. Sarah, this population is functionally extinct from a genetic viability standpoint. I'm estimating fewer than 30 reproductive individuals, maximum. Sarah's vision blurred. The offspring mortality. Multiple factors. High mutation load from inbreeding. But I'm also seeing genetic markers associated with heavy metal toxicity vulnerability, specifically impaired methylation pathways that affect fetal development. If they're in a contaminated environment, their offspring would be the first casualties. It's a synergistic death sentence. Genetics plus environment equals extinction. Can it be reversed? Long silence. Theoretically, reduce toxin exposure, potentially introduce genetic diversity through assisted reproduction technology, intensive medical intervention. But Sarah, we're talking about a species that doesn't exist in any official capacity. Where the hell are these samples from? I can't tell you that yet. Can't or won't. Both. Dr. Reeves, if I revealed the source, it would trigger a cascade I can't control, but I need your help. Can you design intervention protocols, medical treatment for toxin exposure, genetic counseling scenarios, population viability analyses, without knowing the exact context? You're asking me to play God with an unknown species. I'm asking you to help me save people who are dying. Another long pause. Send me environmental samples, soil, water, vegetation from their habitat. If I can model the contamination profile, I might design a detox protocol. And Sarah, if this goes public, I was never part of this conversation. Agreed. Over the next week, Sarah and her team worked frantically. Yuki collected comprehensive environmental samples. James drafted medical intervention protocols based on great ape physiology, adjusted for larger body mass and hominin neurology. Maria consulted with Kino elders, obliquely, carefully, about traditional medicine and forest detoxification practices. And Sarah maintained the communication board dialogue, explaining in pictographic sequences what they'd learned. Offspring, sick, because earth plus water, poison. Also, small group, blood too similar, weak. The response came the next day. We know dying. Can humans help or only understand dying? Sarah's hands shook as she arranged her reply. Help possible. Need clean water, special food, medicine. Need trust, time, see offspring sick. The request was explicit. To intervene, they needed direct access. To see, to diagnose, to treat. The counter-message appeared within hours. Fear. Humans see us. Humans capture. Humans destroy. How? Trust. Promise safe. How, indeed. Sarah had no legal framework to protect them, no government agency she could trust not to turn this into a containment operation. No way to guarantee safety except through secrecy, which required them to trust her absolutely. She thought of the boundary cedar, the dying tree carrying the message witness. They hadn't asked for salvation, they'd asked to be seen, acknowledged in their dying, their existence validated. Sarah arranged tokens. Promise, no capture, no reveal, only help, only us, remember you. And then she added something she'd been carving for days, a physical token, not part of the board's set. A small cedar medallion carved with two figures, human and non-human, standing side by side. Between them, she'd inscribed the Quinault word Maria had taught her, da quab, kin, relations. Sarah hung the medallion on the board and waited. On day 18, Sarah arrived at the boundary site to find the medallion gone and a figure waiting. Not the massive individual from before. This one was smaller, perhaps 6.5 feet, with darker hair and a distinctly gracile build. Female, Sarah realized with shock, and she wasn't alone. Cradled against her chest, wrapped in what looked like woven cedar bark, was an infant. The female figure stood motionless, watching Sarah with dark eyes that reflected unmistakable intelligence and fear. The infant mewled softly, a sound so hauntingly familiar and alien simultaneously that Sarah felt tears spill over. Slowly, deliberately, Sarah raised both hands, palms out, the universal gesture of peace. Then she touched her own chest and pointed to the female. You, me, same. Relations. The female didn't move. The infant cried again, a weak, thready sound. Sarah made a decision that violated every research protocol but honored every ethical instinct. She knelt, lowering herself non-threateningly, and opened her field medical kit. Inside, pediatric electrolyte solution, sterile syringes, basic diagnostic tools. She held up the electrolyte bottle, pantomiming drinking, then pointed to the infant. Hydration. Help. The female's expression, God, could Sarah even read expressions across this divide, shifted. Uncertainty, desperation, and finally, a decision. She stepped forward. Sarah's heart hammered as the female approached, each step measured, cautious. At 3 feet distance, she stopped. Then, with movements that spoke of profound trust and terror, she extended the infant. Sarah took the child, and felt her worldview irrevocably shatter and reform. Warm weight, shallow breathing, a small face that was human and not human, alien and familiar. The infant's eyes, brown, aware, fixed on Sarah's face with recognition of personhood. "Hey, little one," Sarah whispered, "let's see what we can do." The infant was severely dehydrated, body temperature low, signs of systemic toxicity. Sarah administered electrolytes through a careful syringe feeding, the mother watching with laser focus. She checked reflexes, listened to the weak heartbeat, examined skin tone and hydration markers. "Acute toxin exposure," Sarah murmured, knowing the mother couldn't understand the words, but hoping her tone conveyed assessment, not hopelessness. "Environmental contamination, genetic susceptibility, but treatable. She pulled out her satellite phone and texted Yuki, "Medical emergency. Need pediatric chelation therapy, activated charcoal, IV electrolytes at boundary site. Now." To James, "Bring every detox protocol you have. We're in." Then, looking up at the mother, Sarah arranged tokens on the communication board with one hand while holding the infant. Offspring, very sick, but help coming. Strong medicine. Can save. The mother made a sound, low, resonant, with tonal qualities that suggested language. Then she did something that made Sarah's breath catch. She touched Sarah's forehead with one massive palm, gently, briefly. A blessing, a transfer of trust. "Witness," Sarah thought, "I witness you, and I will not let you disappear." Glacier Meadows Field Station, October 31st, 2023. Sarah hadn't slept in 43 hours. The infant, she'd named her Kaya in her mind, from the Quinault word for cedar, lay in a makeshift medical station they'd constructed in the field cabin's back room. James monitored vitals, while Yuki administered chelation therapy through a tiny IV line they'd managed with exquisite care. Outside, beyond the cabin's perimeter, others waited. 4 adults, 2 juveniles, the entire remaining population, Sarah realized with devastating clarity. They'd brought their children, they're sick, they're dying, and placed them in human hands because no other options remained. Maria coordinated the medical logistics with a Quinault network Sarah hadn't known existed. Traditional healers who brought plant-based remedies, nurses who didn't ask questions, supplies that arrived without requisition trails. The conspiracy of silence was growing, held together by shared ethics and the understanding that revelation meant catastrophe. Dr. Reeves arrived on day 3 of the medical intervention, crossing lines she'd never imagined she'd cross. She stood in the cabin staring at Kaya and wept. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. "She's real. They're real." "Can you save them?" Sarah asked bluntly. Reeves examined the 5 children, 3 infants, 2 juveniles, with shaking hands. "The acute toxicity is treatable. Heavy metal chelation, supportive care, time. But Sarah, the genetic bottleneck, that's existential. Without diversity introduction, they're extinct in 2 generations, maximum." What would diversity introduction require? Ethically? Informed consent from the population, genetic counseling, possibly assisted reproductive technology using stored sapiens gametes to increase heterozygosity while preserving their distinct genotype. Practically, Reeves laughed bitterly. A government program with massive funding, legal protections, multi-decade commitment, none of which can happen if they don't officially exist. Sarah watched through the cabin window as one of the adults, the large male from the first sighting, carefully arranged tokens on the communication board they'd moved to the station. We thank humans, save offspring. But what next? What next? Sarah echoed. That's the question. The population was too small, too isolated to survive without intervention. But intervention required infrastructure, resources, legal protection, all of which required disclosure. James joined her at the window. I've been running population viability models under absolute best-case scenarios, zero mortality, maximum reproductive output, no environmental stresses. They might stabilize at current numbers, but any perturbation, any disease outbreak, any hunting incident, extinction within 20 years. And worst case, 5 years. We have 3 options, she said slowly. 1, keep silent, provide covert medical care, watch them slowly die despite our efforts. 2, limited disclosure, bring in federal wildlife agencies, try to establish protected status while maintaining secrecy. 3, full disclosure, public revelation, hoping the world's empathy outweighs its exploitation. Option 1 is passive extinction, Yuki said, joining the conversation. Option 2 likely leads to option 3 when the secret inevitably breaks, which leaves public disclosure with strategic framing, Maria finished. Control the narrative before it controls us, and risk destroying them in the process, Sarah countered. Look what happened with every first contact scenario in history. Indigenous populations decimated by disease, displacement, cultural genocide. This is different, Reeves argued. We're not talking about a human population lacking legal rights. This is a separate species. The scientific and ethical implications would trigger international protocols or justify containment, James interrupted. Quarantine, study, control. They'd become research subjects, not autonomous people. The debate consumed them for hours, each scenario spiraling into darker possibilities. Meanwhile, the population waited outside, trusting humans who couldn't even agree on how to help. Finally, Sarah stood. We're asking the wrong question. We're deciding for them, not with them. They're cognitively sophisticated, self-aware, capable of complex communication. They initiated contact. They made the choice to trust us. The next choice should be theirs. She walked outside to the communication board, aware of the eyes watching from the forest's shadows. Carefully, she arranged tokens in the most complex sequence yet. Humans, no, you dying. Want, help save you. But you help requires, other humans, know you exist. Choice 1, stay hidden. We help, secret, but you'll probably still die. Time. Choice 2, reveal to world, big help possible, maybe live, but just danger, humans can harm, no promise safety. Sarah stepped back, heart hammering. She just asked a dying population to choose between certain extinction in obscurity and possible survival through exposure. The adults conferred. Sarah couldn't hear words, but their body language, gestures, postures, touches, spoke of debate, fear, resolution. After 20 minutes, one approached the board. The large male, the one Sarah thought of as the elder, selected tokens deliberately. We choose live, choose offspring, future, danger, accept, trust, you, show us, to world. Then he added one more sequence. Promise, tell truth. We, people, not animals. Remember us, true. Sarah read the message through blurred vision. They weren't asking for salvation. They were asking for dignity, to be revealed as people, not cryptids. To be remembered as kin, not specimens. Okay, she whispered. Okay, I promise. Seattle, Washington, November 10th, 2023. Sarah stood before the assembled press conference, flanked by James, Yuki, Maria, and Dr. Reeves. Behind them, a screen displayed photographs, genetic data, and carefully edited footage. But beside her, in a protective barrier that maintained distance while allowing visibility, stood two members of the population, the elder and Kaya's mother, who'd chosen to be present for this moment. Sarah had spent 10 days preparing for this revelation, not preparing the world, that was impossible, but preparing the narrative. She'd consulted with indigenous rights attorneys, bioethicists, conservation biologists, and human rights advocates. She'd drafted a disclosure framework that positioned the population as sovereign people, deserving of self-determination, not as wildlife requiring management. Now, facing cameras from every major news outlet, she began, "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, linguistic anthropologist. I'm here to introduce you to a people who have chosen, at great personal risk, to reveal themselves. For tens of thousands of years, they lived alongside Homo sapiens in North America. As human populations expanded, they retreated into the deepest forests, maintaining their culture, language, and autonomy through radical isolation." She clicked to the first image, the carved cedar message. They call themselves Kawadzi, the phonetic approximation the elder had taught her, which translates roughly to the people of the deep cedar. "We call them many names, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Siatik, but these are our words, not theirs. Today I'm asking you to see them as they see themselves, people, relations, kin." The room erupted in chaos, shouted questions, flash photography, disbelief. Sarah raised her hand. "I know this challenges everything we thought we knew, but the evidence is irrefutable." She presented the genetic analyses, the linguistic documentation, the medical records from the interventions. The Kawadzi represent a separate hominin species, likely descended from Homo erectus or heidelbergensis, that survived in small refugial populations. They're not animals, they're not monsters, they're people with culture, language, family structures, and the cognitive sophistication to develop written communication. She clicked to footage of the elder arranging tokens, explaining concepts through the communication board. "They came to us because they're facing extinction. Environmental contamination, genetic bottlenecking, and habitat loss have reduced their population to approximately 25 individuals. 5 children were dying when they reached out. We've been able to save 3 through medical intervention, but long-term survival requires something we can't provide covertly: legal protection, habitat preservation, and assisted genetic rescue." Sarah paused, meeting the cameras directly. The Kawadzi had a choice: die in silence, maintaining the secrecy that protected them for millennia, or trust humanity with their existence. They chose trust. Now, humanity has a choice: prove that trust justified, or become the final extinction pressure that erases them from the world. She stepped aside, and the elder moved forward, 8 feet of living contradiction to human exceptionalism. The room fell into shocked silence. Through the communication board they'd brought, transmitted to the screen behind them, the elder constructed a message. The mother added, "Our children want future. You help?" Sarah provided the translation, her voice steady despite trembling hands. "They're asking if we can share the world, if we can help their children survive. The answer to those questions will define us as much as it defines them." The aftermath was predictable chaos. Government agencies scrambled to establish jurisdiction, scientific communities demanded access, cryptozoologists claimed vindication while sensationalists predicted apocalypse. But beneath the noise, something else emerged, a groundswell of public empathy. The image of Kaya, a tiny, fragile infant, so human and not human, became iconic. Fundraising campaigns for Kawadzi conservation exceeded expectations. Indigenous groups worldwide offered solidarity, recognizing the fight for sovereign peoplehood. Legal frameworks began to evolve, treating the Kawadzi not as wildlife, but as a distinct people with inherent rights. The United Nations convened a special ethics committee. The U.S., Government, under intense international pressure, established the Protected Peoples Zone in Olympic National Park, a 200,000-acre inviolate sanctuary with a no-access perimeter enforced by technology and traditional protocols. Dr. Reeves assembled a genetic rescue team, working under strict Kawadzi oversight. Assisted reproduction technologies, carefully explained and consented to through the now sophisticated communication board, began to introduce genetic diversity through archived sapiens gametes, not replacement, but augmentation, preserving their distinct heritage while providing the heterozygosity for survival. Environmental remediation teams cleaned contamination sources, working upstream to remove the toxins that had poisoned their world. And Sarah, exhausted and transformed, maintained her role as primary liaison, the bridge between worlds, the translator of intentions, the keeper of the promise. Olympic National Park, December 21st, 2023, winter solstice. Sarah stood at the boundary cedar, now protected by ceremonial barriers that both Kawadzi and Quinault had erected together. The dying tree, its carved message of witness still visible, had become a memorial site, a reminder of the cost of near extinction and the choice to reveal rather than disappear. The elder approached, moving with the quiet confidence of someone no longer forced to hide. He carried something wrapped in cedar bark. Through gestures and the shared vocabulary they'd built over months, he explained, a gift, a memory, a teaching. Sarah unwrapped the bark carefully. Inside was a carved tablet, far more elaborate than the tree messages. Pictographic narrative sequences told the Kawadzi story. Deep past when giant mammals roamed, encounters with early sapiens groups, some peaceful, some violent, the long retreat into remoteness, the dying children, the impossible decision to trust, the moment of revelation, the fragile present. At the tablet's bottom, two figures stood side by side, Kawadzi and human, with intertwined hands. Below, a single word in their written language, which the elder had taught her to read, Da-Quab, relations, kin. We remember each other, Sarah said softly. The elder touched her forehead again, the gesture of trust, of kinship, and Sarah understood that this was the answer to the dying cedar's plea, not just witness, not just survival, but relationship, the hardest, most necessary work of all. Behind them, in the protected zone's shelter facilities, Kaya took her first stumbling steps, watched by her mother and the medical team. 2 more infants had been born, their genetic profiles showing the first signs of rescued diversity. The population count stood at 28, not saved, not secure, but possible. James joined Sarah at the boundary. World Wildlife Fund is establishing a long-term monitoring program. UNESCO is considering World Heritage status for the protected zone. And Sarah, he paused, emotion cracking his scientific reserve. 3 major universities want to establish Kawadzi linguistics and anthropology programs, teaching positions. They're asking us to help train researchers in ethical protocols for ongoing communication. Sarah nodded slowly. They want anthropology with them, not of them. Yeah. It was the beginning, not the ending. The Kawadzi faced decades of uncertainty. Genetic rescue was experimental, population recovery fragile, human encroachment relentless despite protections. But they faced it visible, acknowledged, with advocates and allies. Sarah looked at the winter sun slanting through cedar boughs, thinking about the carved message that had started everything. Witness, such a simple request, carrying such profound implications. She'd witnessed extinction's edge. She'd witnessed trust across species. She'd witnessed the choice between silence and speaking, hiding and revealing, dying alone and dying seen. And now, against probability, she was witnessing something else, the stubborn resilience of beings who refused to disappear quietly. What happens next? James asked. Sarah touched the carved tablet, feeling the grooves of the intertwined figures. We keep our promise. We tell their truth. We share the world. And we remember. They were always here. We just weren't looking. From the forest's shadows, a response. the resonant wood-knocking that Kawadzi used for long-distance communication. 3 slow beats, then 3 fast, then 3 slow. The pattern Sarah had learned meant acknowledgement, connection, continuity. We hear you, we see you, we remember. The sound echoed through the ancient cedars, a drumbeat of survival, a message across time. We are still here. We are still here. We are still here. What choices would you make at extinction's edge? Would you hide or reach out, die silent or speak your truth? The Kawadzi chose trust when every instinct screamed for secrecy, and that choice redefined what it means to be human. This story asks us to witness the impossible and believe in the choices that save us. Subscribe to explore more stories where science meets ethics, where discovery demands responsibility, and where the hidden finally speaks. Comment below. If you could leave one message for a population facing extinction, human or otherwise, what would you say? Share this story. Let the message spread. Because some truths, once revealed, demand we act. Remember them. Remember us. Remember that survival is always a choice we make together.